You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Peter Gumbel, journalist and author of They Shoot School Kids, Don't They? He's here to discuss a word that for some translates to chess, but for others evokes the deeply entrenched, demoralizing system that leads many French school kids to feel as though they're on a path not to success, but to certain failure. Echec. So welcome, Peter, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. For anybody who isn't aware of your work, could you just sort of let us know a little bit about you and what you do here in France?
Sure. I'm a writer. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me on. I'm a writer. I used to work as a journalist, and I've then started writing books, including several books about the French education system.
Amazing. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the French education system, kind of talking about this word that I find fascinating, which is échec. Now, échec can be translated into English in a number of ways. It's the word that we use in France for the game of chess, for example. But in specifically the context of school, what would be the closest translation to échec that you can think of?
Well, échec in a school context means essentially failure, dropping out, flunking. And it has a very specific French context because the French really use it a lot in connection with school. Somebody's the word is you're an échec scolaire. You're failing at school. What does that actually mean? It means that in the French context, you get into this death spiral essentially, where your marks go down. You're not following well. You become disillusioned, demoralized, and then it becomes a sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your marks get worse and worse. You get pushed down even further. You become even more demoralized until ultimately, in the case of far too many kids, you drop out altogether without any qualifications. This is something which is not obviously specific to France. You have people who drop out of school everywhere. But in France, the reason why it's really kind of concerning and from the point of view of somebody who's not French, actually kind of something to study, is because there is a culture at school, which I've written about, which is demoralizing, which pushes you down. It doesn't try and lift you up. It doesn't try and say to you, hey, you can do it, you can make it, we'll help you, you can succeed, which is a kind of the very American way of doing things, or the British way of doing things. It's much more the sense of you're failing, we can't do much for you, kind of dig yourself out of your own hole. And so it's a very problematic issue in France. And there are a number of statistics, I won't bore you with too many numbers, but around 100,000 kids drop out of school every year without any qualification. That's about 13% of the school population, which is a lot. And if you ask, as some opinion polls have done, if you ask kids themselves, are they in a situation of échec? Do they feel like they're failing at school? The numbers are much higher. It's something like 20%. And 1 in 5 kids say that they are really struggling badly at school to the point where they fear they're going to fail.
And that's just so, as you said, demoralizing. And I think, I can only speak to my own personal experience with this, but I, grew up in the United States. I went to American private schools, and I came to France in the 9th grade, which was my troisième. And we're going to circle back on the structure of French school in just a second, because I want you to take our listeners through that a little bit, because it's quite different than it is either in the US or in the UK. But I do remember being in my troisième and having come from schools where I was always encouraged and told that I was doing well, and meeting all these people who almost at this point, and were 14 years old, were already kind of jaded by, oh yeah, I'm going to have to redoubler, I'm going to have to repeat this year. Oh, I'm probably getting kicked out. And it was just such a foreign attitude to me. So I think I'm interested to hear a little more about how that kind of this system of échec feeds into, that demoralization of students, and already at such a young age. Did you see that already, through your work, even younger than collège, than 14?
Well, it certainly happens in middle school, in the college. That's where the kind of the big crisis tends to kick in. But already earlier on, I think one of the things that made me start writing about French schools was exactly this culture, this strange idea that school is a place where you don't shine and perform and do your best, but where you languish and become demoralized and fail. And it's so striking culturally for somebody who's not French. And yet, if you are French, it's sort of part of the deal. You just assume this is normal. And in fact, it's interesting talking to French kids who've done exchange semesters abroad and gone to the States, or especially when they go to university. The uplifting culture is overwhelming. It's like, whoa, what is this? You mean we can be encouraged? So I started researching this, and actually found that this cultural difference is very significant and very, very French, in the sense that there are some interesting statistics out there. For example, kids of all ages, if you ask them, how do you feel about school? They'll complain about the teachers, they'll complain about the workload, they'll complain about lots of things. But more or less 80% across the Western world that we know would say, okay, despite all these things about school I don't like, it's a big part of my life. I accept that. I feel at home at school. And when you ask the French, and as some international studies have done, they're less than 50% agree with that. So there's this sort of feeling of belonging which just doesn't exist. And that is a direct consequence of this culture. And when I talk about the culture, I mean in particular the relationship between the teacher and the pupil in the classroom. And obviously, I don't want to generalize. I don't want to say that all teachers are like this. There are some very good teachers in France, like there are some very good teachers everywhere else. There's some very bad teachers in France, like there are everywhere else. But the system as a whole is set up to continually evaluate your performance. And from an early age, even from before college, even in primary school, you're consistently being evaluated, and you get nervous about having bad marks. And the bad marks become more and more important as you go up the system. But even at an early age, even at the age of 6, 7, 8, there is this sort of sense of, whoa, I've got to perform, otherwise I'm going to get into trouble. And the pressure comes not just from the school, obviously, it comes from the parents who grew up in the same sort of system, have seen how bad it is to leave school without a diploma. And so will then, in many cases, put pressure on their own children to perform better. So a very long answer to say that this culture permeates the whole school system. It doesn't just start when you're a teenager, although when you're a teenager, it becomes very acute, because then it becomes much more competitive in terms of, will you advance or will you not advance?
And this constant culture of evaluation that you were talking about also has very immediate consequences in a sort of, I know that the structure of the system has recently changed, so I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about what's happening right now. But as you're evaluated, you get assigned different tracks through school, and there might be times at which a child really is incited to sort of peel off of the main academic track towards tracks that might be better suited to their abilities, but also might sort of take them away from the possibility of attending a main high school or a university. Could you sort of unpack a little bit the structure of the way that one goes through school? I know that school is obligatory starting at the age of 5. You're going to have your primary school, but could you sort of take us through in a Cliff's Notes kind of version, what does the progression of school look like for most pupils, and when are you going to be evaluated to such an extent that you might be taken off of the main track and taken onto a different track?
Okay. Well, I think what I would like to do, if you'll let me, is before we get into that unpeeling and unpacking of the structure, let's talk about the actual marking system, because that's one of the systematic aspects that I looked at, which actually is so difficult for a non-French person to get their head around.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has been changing a bit in the last few years since I wrote my first book, which was very critical of it. But essentially what happens is that most French marks are out of 20. And it's not like in the States or in the UK, we get A, B, C, D, E, F. It's out of 20. And the first thing that you need to know is that, except in a very few subjects, it's almost impossible to get 20. If it's at all subjective, for example, if you're writing a French essay or a history essay or a philosophy paper, you'll never get 20. God gets 20, right? So nobody else gets 20. So 19, 18, that's pretty difficult. So 16 is about kind of the best mark. You can get 16, 17 for many things. Obviously, some of the scientific questions, you can get the answers completely right. Then you will get 20, but that's kind of exceptional. So a good mark for somebody who's in France is if you get 16, it's like, whoa, you're doing really well. And what the important mark at the other end is 10, because that's halfway. And if you get below 10, you're failing. So you have this sort of Gaussian curve, which is used where you get a few people at the very top, a lot of people in the middle, and a few people at the very bottom. And it's the very bottom, less than 10, where you really start to worry because you're less than the average, and therefore, whoa, this is dangerous. But also at the top end, what's interesting is if you can never get an A, if you can never really get in as you would in the States, you're never really being encouraged and congratulated. You do a great essay, it's really good, you get 16. So why try even harder, right? Because you'll never get 20. So there's almost like an institutional setup here with the marking system, whereby it's easy to fail and it's really hard to succeed brilliantly. So what happens is you get a lot of people in the middle feeling mediocre and not being terribly happy. That's part of the problem. Anyway, let me get to your question now about the unpacking the system. So you have primary school, which is classic until about, as you say, compulsory until you get to the age of about 10, 11. And then you get into what's called collège, which is the middle school. And you'll do sixième, which is 6th grade, 5th grade, 4th grade, 3rd grade. And in troisième, in third, they go backwards in France, you have to make the leap at that point. And if you can, you make the leap to the lycée, which is a kind of a classic high school. But if you are not doing very well, there's no automatic transfer into a high school. You have to actually get into high schools, which are sort of separate institutions, and you have to be accepted. So if you've got really bad marks, there's a risk you won't get in. And so what happens is that you will be steered towards a non-academic path, which is known as the lycée professionnel, the kind of the vocational schools. Now, a lot of people don't want to do this. They don't envisage their lives as being plumbers or carpenters or welders, all of which are very honourable professions and which are important, but at the same time are not things that a lot of kids aspire to do when they're 15. And at the same time, it's just you don't have much of a choice. If your grades are not up to it, you get pushed into these schools, and their reputation is pretty bad. Unlike in, say, Germany, where you have a whole culture of apprenticeship, which is honourable and respected, and then you can do an apprenticeship and move, and then go to university. In France, these lycées professionnels, these vocational schools, tend to be seen as kind of dead end places where you go and struggle after that. You then, if you stay in there, if you don't drop out of the system, which is some of these 100,000 people every year who drop out, they drop out at the age of 15, 16. If you stay in, you will then go on to take a baccalaureate, which is the school leaving exam. And if you've gone to a regular school, a regular academic school, a lycée, you will then take the general baccalaureate. And about a third of the French kids do that. And then about another third take the baccalaureate, which is designed for the lycée professionnel, which again is not as respected, but is still a baccalaureate. And then from there, you can go on to university. And what's interesting is if you look at the university statistics, those who have done the kind of the general baccalaureate, who've gone the usual route through a regular high school, they will do okay at university. They'll go on and get jobs and succeed most of the time. Whereas those who do a vocational school will often drop out of university after the first year or less than the first year, and then they'll flounder around. And so there's a very unhappy divide in French society as a result of this system, which is you get peeled off, as you said, you get peeled off at the age of 15, 16 and put into something you don't necessarily want to do. and then it's very hard to claw your way back up again.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And the same thing, it must be said, happens. Well, and this is another place where I'm not sure if the new regulations for the baccalaureate have changed this, but the same is true of kids who do succeed in school, where, you know, if you're doing very well, you'll get pressured to go onto a science track, even if what interests you is social sciences or literature, because you have the grades to stay on the science track, and the science track is perceived to be the most sought after. Is that still true?
Yeah, well, that is still true, and that's again very deeply rooted in sort of the French school culture, that mathematics is the king of all subjects or the queen of all subjects, and if you are good at math, you will do well in life, and if you are not good at math, you probably won't. And so there's, you know, this is school pressure and parental pressure to put your kids into the science track, even if you really don't want to do it and aren't very good at it. This is slightly less acute than it used to be, but it's still the case that it's happened. They've tried to change that. They've tried to mix it up a bit and have a more varied range of subjects you can pick at your baccalaureate if you are good. But it's still the case that many parents and many teachers and schools will be proud of their maths students and not so proud of anybody else. And that's the way it goes. And ultimately, and this is the final part of the system that we need to talk about, which is that at the very pinnacle of the education system are these post-school institutions called grandes écoles, the grand schools, which are grand only in the sense that they are at the pinnacle of the system, because if you look around at the political system, at the business world, you will find graduates of these very few and very selective schools make their way to the top of French society. And if you haven't been to one of these grandes écoles, it's quite difficult to rise up, including into the political elites. You're not going to join Mr. Macron at the Élysée if you haven't been to at least one of these grandes écoles. And to get into the grande école, it's extremely difficult. What happens is you finish school and then you do 2 years of what's called prépa, which is a preparation to get into the grande école. And then the admission to the grande école is by a competition. So you are against everybody else who's trying to apply at the same time, and they have a limited number of places. So you have this 2 years of being prepared. And in my book, I likened this to the hazing first 20 minutes of Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, where you are essentially broken so that you're physically and humiliated until you finally get your answers right. And there's an incredibly high pressure, high intensity, and pretty nasty culture in these prépa. Where you're told, you come out of school, you've done very well at school, which is how you got into the prépa, and the first thing that happens is you're told that you're useless. You get, you hand in an essay and you get 2 out of 20, and your world collapses because you think you've been getting 16s, 17s at school, and suddenly you're already 2, and how is that? And then it's all about essentially humiliating you until they can bring you up to the level where you can succeed. It's again very strange culturally. Very unpleasant, frankly, and for anybody who's not French, totally bizarre. What a strange way to train your elite is to humiliate them before you lift them up.
And these are places, just so that the prépa is going to funnel into these grandes écoles, and the grandes écoles are places that some people might have heard of, like Sciences Po. Are there other famous ones that you could cite?
Yeah, Sciences Po is not actually a grande école.
Okay.
It's a slightly different one, because you don't have to do the prépa to get into Sciences Po. In fact, they stopped that a few years ago, that you can go straight from university into Sciences Po, but you have to pass the competitive exam. So it's very difficult, but you haven't had this sort of broken in training. But there are the most famous grande école, and probably the best grande école is the École Polytechnique, which is a very, very high-powered math and science school, very small intake, and whose graduates go on to essentially run French companies, the biggest French companies. If you look at the background of most of the biggest French companies. There's a very high preponderance of Polytechnique graduates. There's also HEC, which is a business school, HEC. It's one of the most famous business schools. And then if you're in the kind of world of art and arts and humanities, the most famous is the École Normale Supérieure, called Norm Sup, which is again the most high-powered humanities school in France. And these, again, the graduates of these will go on. If you've done Normal Sup, you might end up as a speechwriter for Macron at the Élysée. If you go to École Polytechnique, you might end up as the CEO of the big electrical utility, and so on. So there is this very elitist and very narrow path to the top, which is unusual. If you look at the United States or the UK, for example, yes, you've got the Ivy Leagues in the UK, you've got Oxford and Cambridge. But a ticket to the top of society doesn't automatically go through these places. In fact, yes, if you go to Harvard and go to Harvard Law School, you might become president, but it doesn't mean that you have to go to Harvard Law School to become president, right? So that's the difference. Whereas in France, you pretty much have to have gone to one of these schools to make your way to the very top. So that's one of the reasons, again, if you go back to the marking system, why is it that you have this really strange system which is not designed to encourage and help you progress, but to put you in your place and in some cases to discourage you? The origins of that lie in these grandes écoles because it's a competitive system, because you have to pass competitive exams, you have this essential kind of spirit of selection that flows all the way through the system. So even from an early age, you are already almost unconsciously being selected. Are you the material for this elite that will emerge in 15 years' time or not?
And this almost, dogmatic approach, and what you alluded to earlier about the French having, a high regard for mathematics and almost for a scientific method of thinking, even in the humanities, emerges in a couple of really interesting ways. One of which we kind of already addressed, which is, with the grading system and the fact that you're constantly being docked points as opposed to sort of earning more points, which is how I sort of felt the American system rewards you a lot in partial credit for showing that you know certain things. Whereas, I'll give an example. When I was in high school, I remember I had to do a history exam. I was asked a very specific question about the Civil War, didn't know the answer, and that was the only question on the exam. So I just wrote an essay about something else about the Civil War that I knew something about. And I didn't get 100%, obviously, but I got partial credit for proving that I knew something. Whereas in France, I probably would have gotten a 0 and a big HS written in the margin of my essay. Can you tell me a little bit about hors sujet, HS?
Yes, hors sujet. Well, that's the cardinal sin in the French system is you're off point. Essentially, you're not relevant. You're not answering the question, and as you say, that is very, very seriously punished. There's one interesting test, which is a national test, which is quite revealing. It's a math test called the kangaroo contest, which is given to kids at different stages of their early lives. 7, 8-year-olds already get it. And the marking there is, if you get a right answer, you get 1 point. If you don't give an answer at all, you get 0 points. And if you give the wrong answer, you get -1. So the kind of the context there and the implications of that are this idea of hors sujet, which is it is better to keep your mouth shut than to say something which is wrong and which is not relevant, because you will be docked more severely than if you don't answer at all. And this is something that popped up. I don't know whether you know about and your listeners know about the OECD. They have this PISA program, which is essentially tests for 15-year-olds around the world. It's become a very important international event now, and they will test knowledge and abilities in math and science and in reading and comprehension. And one of the things that they have done as they've looked at the results of these international tests over the years is they've found that French kids are more likely not to answer a question than any other country, because it's been so ingrained in them that if they are hors sujet, if they get it wrong, if they are off point or not relevant, that they will be more severely penalized than if they just leave a blank. So this great French mystery of why do the French kids leave blanks is the answer is because it's in the culture that you just keep your mouth shut if you don't know the answer and if you're not sure of the answer. So that has interesting repercussions on confidence too, right? If you think about it, you're not going to volunteer an answer if there's a risk that it's going to be wrong and you'll be slapped down. It's better just to keep your mouth shut.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm fairly sure that this does have repercussions on French people as they come into adulthood. And, as an overconfident American who's been told to fake it till you make it and to throw things at the wall to see what sticks, do you sort of think that maybe the French adults are less likely to engage in out of the box thinking or in just like throwing ideas out there in even a work context long after they've left school because of this sort of culture?
Well, it's certainly one of the questions that I've been asking, and I try to follow that through and looked at the way that French behave in a work environment. And one of the things that you keep coming across are data points, but also anecdotes about how it is quite hard for French people to get used to teamwork, where you volunteer ideas and you're sharing ideas, and because again, it's not just about saying things that are wrong or that you're frightened of. It's also about sharing things. If you grow up and go to school in a very highly competitive system, the idea of sharing and working together in teams is anathema. And so, obviously in the world of business and in the professional world, teamwork is everything now. And so there's a learning curve. I'm not obviously. I don't want to exaggerate here. There are lots of really brilliant French people, lots of very successful French people who've been through the system, who've overcome the issues that they've dealt with and had to deal with in terms of teamwork, in terms of thinking out of the box. But there's no doubt that if you grow up in a system where that's not encouraged, where you are penalized for making a mistake, and then clearly it's going to have an impact on you later life. So yes, I think the answer there is hard to prove, but there are some data out there that suggest it is complicated. And what's, I think, the most revealing thing is that the French government, the French education system, the French sociology kind of world, the French psychologists themselves, there's a whole movement out there that sees the issues, sees these problems, and is trying to deal with them in a kind of painstaking and rather slow way, but nonetheless at least trying to take them on. So, for example, the marking system in the last 10 years has been evolving. When you're in primary school, they're trying to give you fewer marks out of 20. They want to just tell you, how you're doing in words rather than in numbers. So that's good. Another thing they're trying to do is make it easier to move around. So to create a possibility to have gone through a vocational education and nonetheless get into university or even get into a grande école. They're also looking at ways at bypassing the whole prépa system, this very tough, nasty preparatory system. So a lot of people are doing this now by going to university in another country, for example, and then, or even in France, and then coming back to a grande école later at a different level. So they're trying to make it more supple. They're trying to loosen it up. I think there's a recognition that this is too rigid and not good. But the fundamental issue remains, which is that there is a culture of putting you down. There is not a culture of encouraging you and lifting you up and congratulating you. And that fundamentally, I think, really needs to be changed. And the only way to do that is through intensive teacher training, and perhaps it'll take a generation. But we're not there yet.
Well, we're not there yet, but I think it's really good that we're having these conversations. And, maybe in a globalized world, like you've said, I know that I've had, personal anecdotes of friends who were dreaming of becoming doctors or veterinarians and found that the system that sort of put you down in France was too harsh. And they ended up going to, Germany or Belgium or somewhere else and being able to do that training elsewhere. So hopefully with these changes that you were mentioning, we'll be able to pull some of these kids up and help them avoid this Echec that has been so pervasive and has kind of weighed over and cast a shadow over a lot of. I don't want to paint it as too negative a system, because I think there's some really amazing things about the French system and about the ways in which kids are taught to be extremely rigorous. I think there's a rigor in the French system that I don't see as much in the US system, but obviously, this idea of rewarding partial credit is one thing, and this idea of sort of focusing on faults and flaws in the French system has its positives and negatives. If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, The Heart of You, where expert Annette talks manifesting, tarot, and so much more. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
I think it's also a kind of an antiquated approach. If you spend any time looking at modern thinking in psychology about the importance of motivation, and there's 30 years of really great research about it, that motivation and encouragement are so important, and self-esteem is so important also as a learning tool, that if you are encouraged, you will carry on, you will get deeper into what you're trying to do, you will be motivated to go further, and so there's this whole idea of that's known as self-regulated learning, where you create a virtuous cycle, which is to say, okay, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to be congratulated for working hard and doing well. That'll make me even more excited about working more, and I'll do even better. So that's the cycle you want to create. Whereas in France, unfortunately, they're in the opposite cycle, which is, I'm not doing well, so I'm going to fail, so I'm going to lose my motivation, so I'm going to stop working, and then I will fail, right? So there, between those two worlds is this kind of yawning abyss, and I think that's the big challenge for France in the future, is how do you reverse that cycle and get more towards the idea of, hey, let's be rewarding to people who try, and let's motivate them better.
And are there any elements of the French school system as it stands that you think, as the system is evolving and as we're taking on all of these really important criteria, is there anything that you think should be maintained above all, that, it's a piece of the French school system that is really working quite well?
Well, I think what you mentioned this just now. I think one of the things that's extraordinary about the French school system is that they have very high standards. There is a kind of an expectation of quality, which is admirable. And if you have succeeded in the French school system and you've been through it, you do come out with a kind of a broad general knowledge and an ability to think in a kind of clearly structured way. They have this famous paper at the baccalaureate, the school leaving exam, which is the philosophy paper every year. And, you get asked an abstract question and you have to argue. You have 4 hours to write a paper arguing a point. And that is, remarkable if you can do that. So there's a real idea of standards that is important. And I think the system, the government and the teachers themselves hold on to that dearly and are themselves unhappy at the way that standards seem to be slipping, that the marks seem to be falling, that the performance of kids is not as good as it was 10 years ago, and certainly not as good as it was 20 years ago. So there's some talk about, should we dilute the standards, should we make it easier? And I think it is important to have standards, and it's also what makes France, that there's a sort of perfectionism which is admirable. However, the problem is the reality of French school life is that very few people really make it up to that standard of perfectionism. And so a lot of people are very unhappy, and that's not a good thing at all.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today and for offering all of this insight and expertise. We really appreciate it. Where can our listeners find you? Are you on social media? Where are your books available if they want to hear more about your work and about the French school system?
Yes, well, I have a website, which is petergumbel.com, very original. And you'll see that I have my books on there. All my books are on Amazon. They're in French and in English. The English, the one that focuses, the one that did the best, the one that focuses on this cultural difference is called in French "On achève bien les écoliers." My publisher decided to take the famous book and movie they shoot horses, don't they? And adapt it to my book. So it's, in English, it's called They Shoot School Kids, Don't They? So that's available on the usual channels. And I do, in fact, have a Facebook page called On Achève bien les écoliers, but I'm not really feeling that much more because the movements have been too exhausting, too hard to follow, and I think I said all I need to say in the book itself. But you're very welcome to follow me on Twitter at Peter Gumbel, or on check out my website, and you can find a link if you want to email me. I'm happy to reply if I have the time.
Perfect. Great. And we'll put links to your books in the show notes as well, and to your website. So anybody who wants to read further on this topic can just find those links in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining me today, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Emily, for having me on. Really enjoyed it.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.